And the only time that I believe, and be kind in the comments, when you can actually step out and say, but God, I need to trust you with the generosity thing, is when God lays it on your heart to go above and beyond what you planned for.
Yeah.
And then I think you can, with full conviction, now reach out to God and say, well, God, now you need to come through.
Yeah.
Because if you want me to do this thing, you know my budget, you know my financial constraints, you know my responsibilities, you know what I've done and what I've tried to do and how I've tried to cut back and be a good steward. This is not possible what you want from me. So I'm going to trust you. But now it's not like, oh, I'm going to trust you, and then meanwhile you haven't done your part. If I've done everything that I can, now I can go to God and say, well, if you want this thing, then now I need to see your faithfulness.
Welcome back to the WorshipGear Podcast. Thank you so much for continuing to support the podcast. We've had some excellent feedback on our last couple of episodes, and we're just really grateful for the support. I think we have a really interesting topic today. I want to welcome Rudolf onto our podcast for today.
Hello.
We're going to be talking about some finance, money, generosity, and just to give a bit of background into who Rudolf is and what gives him the right to talk about money with everybody, because we know that's a little bit of a hectic topic sometimes. Rudolf is one of our worship leaders. He's my favorite worship leader to
You probably say that to everyone, don't you? But it's fine, I'll take it.
So Rudolf is part of the worship family, which fits into what we do here. But Rudolf, in his professional life, is a senior financial planner.
Correct.
So I can't forget that senior part, because apparently that's important. So he knows
I
his
just
stuff.
feel tall if somebody calls me senior.
So Rudolf definitely knows his stuff in talking about finances and being able to talk to us a little bit about generosity and what that entails, especially in the church context, because we know that can be a little bit of a hot topic, considering some things that have happened in the church world recently. But that's why we want to have this conversation, to kind of not dispel or talk down about anybody, but what is generosity from a Christian perspective? What should we be doing? How should we be handling our finances? Anything you want to say to introduce yourself, Rudolf?
Yeah, it's wonderful to be here. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to talk around this topic that I'm really passionate about. My wife and I last year started presenting a course around financial management within the life of the church. And it's just been really wonderful to see how people have changed their perspectives, have shifted their behavior to align it to the biblical model of being good stewards, which includes generosity. So it's something that's really close to our heart, and I have the same opportunity to do that within my day-to-day life as a planner within the lives of clients. And it's interesting to see the either hold that money can have over your life, or just to see the freedom that it can provide you when your perspective around money is good and when it's healthy. So I'm really excited to delve into the conversation today.
Cool. So before we start into the whole generosity and money topic, I want to just briefly touch on tithes. Now, this is obviously not going to be the topic for today, because there's a whole bunch of theology that goes into that. And we know that that can be a contentious topic because of Old Testament law versus New Testament and everything like that. But from just a brief overview quickly. So my perspective on that, and granted, none of us are pastors here, none of us are theology experts or anything like that. So this is purely our opinion and our small little viewpoint, just for clarity there. But tithing has become important in the church because, number one, it was an Old Testament law, but I do think that there is still value in tithing under a principle point of view. And we can go into various topics, but again, we're not here to talk theology. And I just want to know your brief viewpoint on where you stand on tithing.
So giving is a non-negotiable, and it's got to do with our hearts around the matter. I think Jesus in the temple, when asked if giving your taxes is a thing that essentially Jewish believers should be doing at that point in time. And very simply, Jesus asked for a coin, and he asked them, well, whose face do you see on the coin? And they replied, well, obviously Caesar's. So his response was, give to Caesar's what is Caesar's, whether we like it or not, especially in the South African context, if we talk about taxes. But also, and then he ended with give to God what is God's.
Yeah.
So there wasn't a question around that. Because if we believe that everything that we have comes from God, one of our responses in worship to Him would be putting money in its rightful place, which is not being masters of us or being mastered over us or us being subservient to money, but it's actually us being good stewards of it. And part of our stewardship is being generous and giving back to God what is His in any event. So I think with that as sort of my perspective on it, I think it just grounds our thinking as a family around money. So it's maybe a difficult topic for some simply because of past bad experiences, past hurts. And I agree with you, the intention is not to try and figure this out here and now, but whatever your viewpoint around giving and generosity, it's important to go back to the word and test your belief to what scripture says, as opposed to just holding on to things someone once said, or maybe things that you believe because you were told this thing. And whether you're for tithing or against tithing, in either one of those two options, you should still take it to the Bible and see whether your belief ties up to what the Word of God says, and then pray about it. I think that's maybe just the easiest way to say, like, it's a personal matter between you and God. And Old Testament, I'm busy reading through Exodus now. Yes, like if you didn't tithe, you were pretty much dead.
Yeah.
So we don't have that. But I think we also shouldn't live in fear of what if we make a mistake, because God looks at our hearts, right? So He looks at our convictions and why we do what we do.
Yeah.
So thank goodness that we don't get stoned if we don't do everything correctly. That would have been a tough thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that as a backdrop, I think the generosity conversation is something that in any event not supersedes, that is over and above sort of whatever your decision is around giving. Because generosity, I think that we spoke about before the recording started, was, well, generosity is more than just being generous with your money, right?
Yeah.
It's around every aspect of your life.
Yeah, because what if someone doesn't earn a salary or doesn't have an income, for example, because then they can't tithe in the traditional sense, because you can't give 10% of nothing. 100%. But before you go to the generosity thing, there's a couple of things that you said that I think stand out very clearly, is that a lot of people have their perception because of past church hurt. A lot of people have been hurt by the church. A lot of people have their experiences based on what they see in media or on TV, or, oh, but this church did that, or this is just a prosperity gospel kind of a thing, and people just want money. And that experience has taken away from our generosity. And that's where I think is one key thing that we need to talk about, is we need to differentiate our experience from church and what the Bible actually says. And another thing you said that I like is that giving is a non-negotiable, because now we're not talking about tithing anymore. We're talking about giving, because now how do you give? Do you give generously? Do you give, what percentage do you give? Because then it's not restricted to your 10% tithe, because now we're not having a tithe conversation anymore. Now we're moving on to that generosity conversation that you said. And that's kind of more where we want to talk about, is what is the heart of a generous giver? And what does that mean from a financial point of view, from someone who's earning a salary, from a time point of view, from maybe someone who's a student who just finished the normal schooling year and is volunteering at church? That's giving. That's being generous with your time. Someone who is on a worship team, like we've discussed multiple times, that worship is sacrificial. That is something that is a time thing that you are giving. So you can be generous in various ways, but there is a level of generosity from a financial point of view that we do need to adhere to, not adhere to, but see to as well, because there are financial needs. And I think that's where we kind of talk about this whole generosity thing.
I think it's also important to have the perspective around what the money is actually for.
Yeah.
Right. Yes, you can argue very quickly, and this is at the fringes of the conversation, which I think is like pointless conversations anyway. Yeah, why did the church have to be that big? Or why did they have to have this or that? Yeah, they could have done with so much less. But let's not delve into the weeds of that conversation. It comes down to, there's a need. There's a need to have space for somebody to come in and be in a building of some sort to receive the word. and to be prayed for and to worship together as a congregation. So for that, a building costs money. So it's an easy one. I think it's also, there's other needs within the life of any church where people go through hard times and they might not have family. They might not have other people to turn to. And the one place that Paul is very clear about, what we should never neglect, is to look after the widows and the orphans. And that speaks to, if there's a need in body, we need to be able to cater to that need as well. And that requires money, because groceries costs money. If there's somebody in the life of the church that needs to get to their job, but they actually don't have money for petrol, or they don't have transport and they need to pay for transport to get to their job to earn the money that they can, they need money. So if everybody was just generous with their time, generous with their talents, and generous with their lives, but not generous with their money, life would be very, very tricky. So I think as a backdrop of, again, going back to what we said earlier, giving is a non-negotiable. The only thing that you can do when it comes to giving is check your heart. And are you doing it generously? And are you doing it as a cheerful giver, as the New Testament speaks to? And I think the needs are great. And there's a lot of people who are in need. And I think we can address those needs through our financial giving. I think one of the examples I saw this week, again, with our one organization, a church called One Life, they run an incredible curriculum in the education space in Visantekral. And every year they've got an intake of grade R learners, and then they've got an after-school focus on helping kids just get better educated, just because of the lack of resources in some of our communities across the country. And a very easy way to get involved is to sponsor one of these kids, for example, so that they can go to school to better themselves from an education perspective, and so that one day they can also put themselves in a position where they can go into life and earn an income and give back to society, secondary, but firstly give their lives to God. And that's an easy way. But again, One Life can't operate without money. So again, I think there's such an unfortunate stigma around money specifically because of a lot of things. But I think if it comes down to it, we need money
100%
to do things. But there's just a way in which I think we can go about talking about it where it can be very liberating and freeing, as opposed to being a topic that is avoided from a not from a church perspective, but from Christians not wanting to talk about it because everybody's like got a thing about money, right? But you know what's funny? In my line of work, we don't take on clients on the basis of them being Christian or not, right? We help clients with a need. And clients with a little bit of money and clients with more than enough money than they will ever need, everyone's got the same fear around money. So money is not just an interesting conversation in the context of church and Christianity, but money is just a difficult conversation, period, because of everything that's attached to money.
Yeah. And that brings a couple of scriptures to mind for me. When you talk about the individual and what their approach to money is, because like we chatted earlier, money is an emotional topic and it becomes emotional for people. And people don't want to talk about it because money kind of drives the world, or it drives a lot of things that we need. And that's what the Bible says, that the root cause of evil is the love of money. It's not money itself. It brings it back to the emotional. It is the love of money.
Correct.
Then there's the scripture that we chatted about earlier, Ecclesiastes 10:19. I think there was, and we're not here to talk down about anybody or to knock any pastor, but there is a pastor that preached in this scripture, and he kind of took one verse, which says, it's the end of verse 19. So Ecclesiastes 10:19, you guys can go look it up as well. It says that money solves everything. But when you go look at the context of that entire chapter, it contrasts good and bad. And it contrasts how people can be using money differently and how they can benefit from it. It's better to do this than that. It's better. So like I encourage people to actually go read that entire chapter 19. But that brings about, again, that stewardship component. So you've got an emotional component of money, which biblically the love of money is the root of all evil.
Correct.
And we have the emotional aspect of that, but we also have the stewardship aspect. So I'll talk a little bit about the stewardship part a little bit, and then I'd love it if you can talk about the emotional part of it. So for me, the stewardship part, and I'll use our church as an example because we do have a big building. We do have a lot of space, but there are requirements for that. So if you look practically, if somebody walks up to us and said, but why does your church have such a big building? Why do you have so much space? It's because, one, we need it. We currently, our church is in a position where we physically don't have space for people anymore. So we've got essentially three options. We can either send people away because there are limitations legally speaking from, like we in South Africa, so we have to abide by the laws. There are building regulations. You can only have a certain number of people per square meter in a building. If you're going to have X amount of people, you need a building X amount of size. So that, like you said, it's easy to answer the question of why do you need a big building? Well, because the law says we do. First of all, because this is how many people we have. As a church, we can either send those people away, which is something we never want to do, because the church is supposed to be a place for open doors and for people to come in. So the other option that we have is to either open up more services, but then we need more volunteers because we need people to host the people. So that's counterintuitive because it means we need more people to host more people, essentially. Or the third option is to expand, and that costs money. And then we have to expand according to regulation. We have to expand so big to house so many people. So that's just a practical aspect of how a church can steward its money correctly by saying that we've reached a point now where we want to invite more people, but we have to do something about it. And that costs money. And that's where the generosity, and I love our pastor because he's never ever pushed, we're going to have a building fund, we're going to do this. He said, it'll take as long as it takes. It's up to the congregation of how generous do you want to be for us to do this expansion. And I think that's a great approach because it puts the generosity part of it onto people's hearts. If you want more people, if you want us to have more people saved, if you want to have a bigger environment or a bigger space, then it's about your heart of generosity. But it's still the responsibility of the church to steward that money properly, because if I'm going to see a pastor driving a fancy car after I've donated R1 million to the church, then there's a bit of a question that rightly so we can answer or we can ask. But if the church stewards that money properly, then there will be growth. You'll be able to see the fruits of proper stewardship. So I don't think the question that an outsider should look at is, why does your church have such a big building? I think the question should be is, how is the church stewarding their money? Are their financial books open? Can I go ask the pastor what's happening with this, what's happening with that? If those things are in place, then I think you're in the right space or in the right place. That's from the stewardship point of view. If we talk about the emotional point of view, that's why I want to ask you a little bit more because...
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. I just want to segue a little bit into what you said around the stewardship component. And the stewardship component is obviously something that can be done corporately, so within an organization, around how do we allocate our income and how do we manage our expenses and what do we put towards capital expenditure and what do we put towards interest repayments on loans. Basic principles around how to run a business well. But similar principles apply to us as individuals.
Yeah.
So the same as any good organization should have a sound financial management. So we as individuals should have sound financial management. And what's interesting around the financial management of an individual is that it's not always the technical things that drive our decisions. So it's not just our budgets when we talk about financial management of an individual, coming back to the stewardship component, that drives our decisions. Because if it was a logical thing, if it was a prefrontal cortex kind of thing that is our critical decision-making faculty, none of us would be in debt. Nobody would spend more than they earn because the numbers say I've got 10 Rand that I need to spend.
10 Rand.
Then I can only spend 10 Rand. Hopefully I spend 9 and I can do something else. So then the question to ask is, well, why, if we all think that we are rational, why do we behave irrationally? And that's because there's a big connection linked to money and to our self-esteem around our spending habits. So we call it that money's actually got two sides. There's the technical side of money, which is everything to do with your cash flow management, how you manage investments, and how taxes impact upon you, and how you would manage risk. But then on the flip side is what we call the personal side of money, which is where our emotions come in, which is where our self-esteem comes in, a sense of well-being and our hopes and our dreams, and also our relationships with people and our relationship with things. And interestingly enough, 90% of our decisions are driven by the personal side of money, not by the technical side. So now we need to ask the question, why do people sometimes lack the necessary stewardship of their finances? Why aren't people generous? Because it's not a quantum of money thing. Can't speak for all people, but there's a lot of people that have got the capacity to be generous, right? Because they've got more money than they need to spend.
Elon Musk.
100%. Even in our own community, we've got people with a lot of money. And again, nothing wrong with having a lot of money, right? If you're a good steward, that's ultimately where you'll end up, not being a prosperity gospel, but if you work with your money well and you're obedient, that is just the natural progression of how things work. So I think from that context, why are a lot of people that we perceive to be wealthy not necessarily generous? And it's also a tough thing to actually look at from the outside because you don't actually know if they're generous. But if you just look at the context of churches worldwide and the amount of membership that a church would have versus the amount of people that's in that membership who actually give towards the giving on a regular basis.
I think I saw a stat the other day that it says most churches, if you're hitting 30% of your membership who consistently give, then you're actually doing really well.
Okay,
so what's the other thing?
Okay, so 3 out of 10 would be people that in the context of a church who are Christians, who profess to believe in God, who profess to believe that the Bible is the inspired word of God and that it's true, and that they hopefully read the Bible as well, and then they don't give. Okay, so then the question is, okay, maybe disobedience, right? We all disobedient somewhere in our lives, but that's not, I think, always so easy to pinpoint. And I think the second side of money, the personal side of money, is oftentimes where I think we fall into the trap of not being able to be generous, even though we know that we're called to be generous, even though we're called to steward our money well, and part of that is giving. And it's oftentimes that the emotional side of money and that sense of well-being where I don't feel that I am in a position to give generously because if I give money away, I'm going to lack.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's a personal thing again, whereas like I might be wealthy, I need to pay my bills first. I need to do that first. I have a car payment. What if my kid gets sick? What if this happens? I need to have a little bit of cash flow, and therefore I can't be generous. That's that personal aspect again.
Correct. And the interesting thing around that for me is if you steward your money well, you'll be able to do both. Yeah. It's not an either or. It doesn't matter how much you earn or how little you earn. It's not an either or. It's a case of actually coming back to practical money management structures, knowing how much you earn. It's a big deal. It's actually funny if I say that out loud, but I know people who've got no clue what they earn. They can't tell you how much money comes into the bank account every month, and they certainly don't know how much money goes out of the bank account every month. But that's an important part.
Yeah.
So if you want to get the personal side of money under control, under the lordship of Christ, not under the lordship of our own emotions, we need to do some practical things. And one of those things is my Afrikaans is coming out here strong. I'm going to just do the next part in Afrikaans. We actually need to budget. So part of the course that my wife and I present annually at church is a course developed by Dave Ramsey from the United States. They started an organization called Financial Peace University, part of their Ramsey Solutions business, where many years ago, they started talking to people about money, because that was a topic that even to today is not a topic that is widely spoken
Yeah.
about. It's a topic where there's a lot of shame and a lot of guilt and a lot of fear around. And if we don't talk about it, if we don't bring it to light, that's what the New Testament also speaks into. Confess your sins one to another so that someone can pray for you and keep you accountable. Paraphrasing now.
But that's a good principle, because being in debt is not necessarily a sin, but we keep it inside because we're ashamed of it. But if you bring that shame to light, you can get help. You can
and then
get
you can
assistance
do something about it. 100%. And I think you touched on a great point. We're going to do a little bit of a segment, then we'll come back. But you said being in debt is not a sin. 100%. Right? Now, Old Testament, Proverbs, Book of Wisdom speaks about don't go into debt because it's a dumb thing to do.
Yeah.
But it's not a sin. Just like smoking's not a sin. But I love Andy Stanley, where in one of his series, he just kept asking the question, what is the wise thing to do?
Yeah.
Right? Nothing wrong with smoking. But is it the wise thing to do? Right? And then we can go into all other kind of decisions that we make as people. So, for example, from a personal financial management perspective, is it wise to over-indebt yourself? No, because it's got negative impacts. But we need to then manage the tension between this instant gratification of, but I need that new car. Cool, I'll just finance it. It's only $5,000 a month. Not that bad.
But you don't factor in all the other things that go with that $5,000 a month thing. And again, like you said, it's that instant gratification. And that's an emotional response again, which brings you back to the personal,
and the side of money, 100%. So in this course, the stuff that we teach is practical next steps in order to get your money under control so that we can get our emotions under control. But the thing is, why do we feel overwhelmed? Normally when we are devoid of fact.
Yeah.
Okay? We don't feel overwhelmed necessarily. This isn't for all circumstances, but we don't normally feel overwhelmed if we're in control. And we're normally in control if we know the facts of a situation. Yeah. But when we're unsure of the facts, then we have the potential to feel under pressure. So what would some of these principles help you with? Well, they would help you get clarity, help you get the facts. Okay, how much money do I actually earn? How much money do I actually currently spend? Forget if you should be spending it or not. Just, do you actually know where your money is going to? Do you actually know how much debt you have? Because oftentimes our financial position is a lot better than we think it is, because we make, at least in my life, I make mountains out of molehills because of pressure.
I thought you were going to say mountains of money. Now I was going to be like, share the knowledge.
Hopefully, but not at the moment. 2 kids in a house, man. So essentially what we do is we make these mountains out of situations that sometimes aren't as big as they seem, but they feel big.
Yes.
So that doesn't change, right? It's still important to take into account how it feels, but then we need to decide, okay, how are we going to operate from here? Are we going to operate out of that fear and that anxiety? Or are we going to proactively try and tackle the subject of money and finance? Because if you don't manage your money well, you will never be generous. Because then you'll
have this mountain of, I don't have money, so how can I be generous because of this and this and this and that?
Correct.
When it's actually not as big a problem as you think it is. So again, like you say, I agree with you that get the facts. And that comes down to the shame aspect back again, whereas I'm too ashamed to tell somebody about my money stuff because of shame. Whereas if you came to someone like yourself as a financial advisor, which I think is a very great thing to have, that person can put your financial situation into context and say, actually, you're not that bad off. Actually, you can do this, or you can do that, or you can lower this payment, or there's things that you can do from a financial point of view, which at the end of the day will allow you to be generous.
Correct. So I think getting confronted with your reality is a hard thing to do. And shame is a big deal. You regret decisions that you made, and you regret decisions that you didn't make. So having the courage to actually tackle your current financial position and your current situation head on is an important thing, and it takes courage. And sometimes we need some encouragement. Sometimes we need people to come alongside us, not just to know what our rand and cents are. I think if you're married, your spouse is the first person that should know about your financial position. They need to know around the decisions that you've made. I think hearing in today's world that a spouse doesn't know what their partner earns is ridiculous. And I don't know how you make decisions as a family if there's not total transparency. That's an important part to it. So generosity is something that comes from your heart, but also if you actually have a means, right?
Yeah.
Because I can, in theory, be very generous, but if I don't have the money to back it up or the time to back it up, then it's quite pointless if I say I'm a generous person or I want to be a generous person, but I've got nothing to be generous with.
Yeah.
So
it's a silly financial decision. It's also, I'm going to be generous to the church, but I don't actually have the financial capability to be generous.
correct.
I could be giving 1,000 rand a month to the church, but I don't actually have the 1,000 because then my bond is going in arrears and my this isn't it. That's not also a wise decision.
Correct. And that's a tough thing to manage, that tension between being obedient and being wise, right? And that I don't think anybody can give you clear guidance on. That is something that you need to take to the Lord in prayer to say, well, like I feel like you're pressing on my heart to be generous, but I don't know how the math will work out. But that's only if you've done the math. If you haven't yet done the math, first go back and do the math, because in all likelihood, you probably already have that means available. You just choose not to engage in that. You choose to rather enjoy your life as well and then want to be generous, and then you put yourself under pressure. So it's actually not your generosity that puts you under pressure. It's your own spending that puts you under pressure.
Because there's people that will go on and they will say, but where's your faith? Where's your, if you give generously, the Lord will provide. And yes, there is an element of faith that we need to have, because in our generosity, we can have faith that the Lord will guide us and that things will happen and that we will prosper, because the Bible does say that the Lord wants us to prosper. But rightly so, if you are being generous, you need to look at yourself first, because are you making wise decisions? That is, I think, the first principle, because if you are making wise decisions based on fact, then you can be generous, then you can put your faith into action. But if you're going out and you're eating McDonald's every single day and every week, and you're actually spending money that you don't have, that's not a wise decision. So you can't go back and say, no, Lord, I'm gonna put my 50 rand into the offering basket, and I'm gonna have faith that the Lord's gonna solve my problem, but then I go straight back to McDonald's. That's not wise.
No, exactly. And I think if you're listening to the podcast now, the last thing that I want for anybody listening is to feel a sense of guilt and shame and condemnation. Not at all. Yeah. I hope you feel a bit convicted around your spending, because you are actually in a position to practically do something about it. So part of the steps in this financial peace course, which I think is so wonderful because it's so easy, is that you set up a budget. So know what comes in every month and know what goes out. So track that. So practically, how would you budget? If you've never budgeted before, that's okay. There's many people who don't budget. It's probably more people don't budget than people who actually budget.
It's always the first step in every single financial course that you do. Budget.
Do you have a budget? And it doesn't have to be overwhelming. It could feel overwhelming because of your spending choices that you might not be happy with. But let's not worry over the past. Let's figure out where to from here. I mean, we're almost at payday. Part of this recording, we're on the 16th of Feb. I don't know when this is going to go out, so we'll see how quick you guys edit. But payday is literally a few days away. So what can you do? Well, I can't do anything about the fact that I'm already over budget this month. But for next month, I can say, okay, what am I going to earn and what are my expenses? And then I can actually have a look at, okay, if I'm over budget, how do I get myself into budget? And that's going to require sacrifice. But it's the sacrificial living that over time will allow you to live generously.
Yeah.
It doesn't work the other way around. You can try and be generous, but then the question is, are you going to feel guilty for doing that? So now, even though outwardly you were generous because you gave to something or someone or helped someone out, but if you didn't plan for that generosity, then the moment you let go of that money, are you then going to go, oh, I shouldn't have done that.
Yeah.
I know I should, but just was, and then you start second guessing yourself, which is also not, I think, a healthy way to live financially. These things should be planned. And when you are then after you've planned, so you know your income, you know your expenses, you know your responsibilities, and you then decide to be generous and you plan for it and you do it, then there's no regret. There's no worry around, oh, I shouldn't have or I should have. And if you do budgeting correctly, what is so wonderful to hear from so many people that we've worked with is when budgeting is done correctly, you actually don't feel contained or restricted by your budget, but you actually feel freedom to spend the money that you've correctly allocated. So if you like clothing, right? And you say, you know what, this month I feel like getting a wardrobe refresh or I need some stuff for work, and you put out 1,000 Rand for clothing, which arguably isn't a lot. It's like half a pair of shoes. But now you put it out. If you didn't budget for it, if you didn't plan for it, and then you go to the shops and you tell yourself, but I need it for work, I need it for this or that.
You're going to run into problems later down the month.
You can either run into problems later in the month, or you're just going to feel guilty because you don't know what the impact is of your decision. Yeah. So I spend it, but I'm not sure if I should have. But on the flip side, if you plan for it, then every single time I swipe my card at the shops for something that's within my budget, I actually feel quite excited. If my budget for clothing this month is 1,000 Rand and we go to the shops and I buy clothes for the month and I've spent up to that 1,000 Rand, I feel proud of myself because it's now not shame because it's planned for, and I know that I'm doing the right thing with my money. Yeah. And the same thing with our generosity. Our generosity should be planned for. And the only time that I believe, and be kind in the comments, when you can actually step out and say, but God, I need to trust you with the generosity thing, is when God lays it on your heart to go above and beyond what you planned for.
Yeah.
And then I think you can, with full conviction, now reach out to God and say, well, God, now you need to come through. Yeah. Because if you want me to do this thing, you know my budget, you know my financial constraints, you know my responsibilities, you know what I've done and what I've tried to do and how I've tried to cut back and be a good steward. This is not possible what you want from me. So I'm going to trust you. But now it's not like, oh, I'm going to trust you. And then meanwhile, you haven't done your part. If I've done everything that I can, now I can go to God and say, well, if you want this thing, then now I need to see your faithfulness.
There's a lot of examples and I want to pause the conversation here because I think we're going to need a part 2 to go into the more practical side of things. But what I love about the conversation is that we've tackled this whole aspect of generosity coming from a personal aspect and not the technical aspect of money, about being a personal decision, and that's emotional, and that comes with a lot of things. And we've dealt with step 1, which I think is the budgeting, because you ask, I mean, we did a series now recently in church, and our pastor said one thing. He said, if you're going to start tithing, he's got this 10-month challenge where you start with 1%. And that's something that somebody can do practically because it goes back down to the planning. So if we look practically at the average salary in South Africa is about 23,000 Rand. That's what the statistics say is the average. At the moment, we know that's not the reality, but if you take that 1% of that's about 200 bucks, that means that someone can sit down and plan, which is the first step that we've discussed about his plan. He said, instead of going to McDonald's this month, I can give 200 Rand. That's a step on making a wise decision. And it's not about giving the 200 Rand to the church. It's about the fact that you are starting to plan and you are starting to look at your financial position and start making wise decisions. And then that teaches you principles and that teaches you how to actually manage your money properly. So what I want to do with the part 2 is I want to go into more of that practical aspect of what is the next steps after budgeting? What can I do to build my financial wealth? And when we say wealth, I don't necessarily mean being rich, but I mean you can talk to someone about being debt-free, that's how you can be more generous, being able to manage your financial situation properly, because living in any context nowadays is expensive. We know that the average salary doesn't cover the average cost of living. So how do you manage that? And it starts with step 1, which we've dealt with, is identifying the personal aspect of money, identifying the emotional connection with money, being able to say that, hey, the shame of what I feel if I'm deeply indebted, it's not an issue, it's getting help. And then starting with step 1 is budgeting. And then we can have a discussion on part 2 of how do we expand that and what is the more practical aspect. But I absolutely love this conversation. I think it's very valuable. And I think to close off part 1, do you have any advice on the budgeting side or any closing thoughts?
it's easier than you think. Sometimes the most difficult thing to do is just to start. So find a tool, find an app, find something that can just help you make it slightly easier, and then just give it a shot. And the first 3 months of budgeting is hard. It's hard to get into the rhythm. It's a new skill you have to learn. It's a new habit, and forming new habits, especially helpful habits, are very hard to do. Starting to smoke is very easy because that's a bad habit. But like good habits are hard, but you pick the fruit of those habits.
Yeah.
So just start. So literally just with payday coming up, look at your budget, set it up. And then most importantly with budgeting is actually just using your budget, because there's very little point in planning to spend only 3,000 Rand a month on groceries this month. But then at the end of the month, you go, I overspent. But if you didn't track your budget.
Yeah.
Have a budget and work your budget would be like a great first step. And there's many apps to do that. So find a tool online or find an app, use Excel, use a piece of paper. Like take your slippies, keep it, and then write it down. Anything is better than nothing. And you'll see it gets easier as you go along, and it gets exciting. It really gets exciting if you can start managing your money well, and you'll see that there's margin, because it's with the margin that you can do so much. But it's the lack that I think prohibits a lot of our good intentions.
Thank you so much, Rudolf, for having the conversation. We'll definitely stay tuned for part 2. We can track more of this practical aspects of managing our money. And then closing thought from my side is don't make a mountain out of a molehill.
That's it.
So, thank you very much for joining. Stay tuned for part 2, and we'll be back with more episodes.